Hi, my name is Matthew, and this is Reef Discovery. 12 minutes after takeoff from John F. Kennedy International Airport, on the evening of July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 fell out of the sky over the Atlantic Ocean, killing all 230 people aboard. The official investigation that followed produced a conclusion so contested, so disputed by witnesses and independent analysts, that 30 years later, an underwater robot descending to the wreck has retrieved data that is forcing the entire case back open. Buried inside the cockpit voice recorder is a second voice. That voice does not belong to anyone on the crew. The night of July 17, 1996. It was a Wednesday evening in the middle of summer. The kind of evening where the air sits heavy and the sky over Long Island Sound turns that particular shade of orange that makes you stop and look at it. Families were on the beach, fishermen were out on their boats, people were barbecuing in their backyards. It was, by every measure, an ordinary night. TWA Flight 800 had pushed back from the gate at Kennedy Airport, running about an hour late. The aircraft was a Boeing 747, one of the most proven commercial jets ever built. It had been in service since 1971. It had logged more than 93,000 flight hours. The crew was experienced. The route was routine: Paris, France, via a transatlantic crossing that airlines had been flying for decades without incident. 212 passengers were aboard, 18 crew members. Among the passengers were teenagers from a Pennsylvania high school French club traveling abroad for the first time. There were families, couples, business travelers, a group of TWA flight attendants, deadheading to a connecting assignment. There was a retired couple. There were children. There were people who had saved for years to make this trip happen. At 8:31 in the evening, the aircraft climbed through approximately 13,800 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 8 miles south of Long Island. And then it exploded. I've been sitting on this story for 6 months because I wanted to make sure I got every detail right before sharing it with you. This is not a case that rewards carelessness. The families of 230 people have spent 30 years fighting for an honest answer, and the least I owe them is precision. Witnesses on the ground described what they saw in the sky that evening in terms that are almost impossible to reconcile with each other. Some saw a fireball. Some saw streaks of light rising before the explosion. Some described a flare. Others described something that moved. Within minutes, debris was raining into the Atlantic. The largest piece of aircraft, the center section of the fuselage, struck the water with enough force to leave a debris field stretching across miles of ocean. There was no distress call. There was no time. The aircraft was gone in seconds. 230 people were gone with it. The nation went into shock. What we were told, the National Transportation Safety Board launched what would become the largest aviation investigation in American history. The FBI joined them, which was itself unusual. You do not typically send the FBI to investigate mechanical failure. The investigation consumed 4 years, cost approximately $40 million, and ultimately produced a conclusion that the NTSB stood behind completely. The center fuel tank exploded. Flight 800 carried a nearly empty center wing fuel tank. In the summer heat on the tarmac at Kennedy, with the air conditioning packs running directly beneath it, that tank had been superheated. The fuel inside had been partially vaporized. The resulting fuel-air mixture was in exactly the ratio required to combust. All it needed was an ignition source. Investigators concluded that a short circuit in the fuel quantity indication system had provided that ignition. A spark, a fraction of a second. 230 lives. Case closed. The NTSB held press conferences. They built a reconstruction of the aircraft in a hangar in Calverton, New York, piecing together recovered wreckage like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle that took years to complete. They produced animations showing the sequence of events. They published a final report that ran to thousands of pages. They were thorough, at least on the surface. and a remarkable number of people never believed them. Some of those people were cranks. Some were conspiracy theorists chasing ghosts. But some of them were aviation engineers. Some were acoustics experts. Some were retired military officers. Some were the 270 witnesses who had stood on the beaches and the boats of Long Island that evening and watched something rise toward the aircraft before it exploded. And some of them were the families of the dead, who had read every page of that report and found that certain things simply did not add up. The FBI conducted 270 witness interviews. 270 people described in varying terms a streak of light ascending toward the aircraft. The official explanation was that these witnesses had seen burning fuel falling from the already exploding aircraft and had misinterpreted the direction of travel due to the confusion of the moment. They had seen the fire going down and thought it was going up. 270 people, all mistaken, all looking at the same sky, all reaching the same wrong conclusion. I'll be honest with you. When I first came across this, I was convinced it couldn't possibly be true. I had to go verify it myself, and what I found did not make me feel better. 230 people in one recovered box. The recovery operation that followed the crash was extraordinary. The water depth at the crash site was approximately 120 feet, shallow enough for saturation divers to work the wreck, but deep enough to make every hour of recovery treacherous. Navy divers, FBI evidence recovery teams, and NTSB investigators worked in rotations for months. They recovered roughly 93% of the aircraft by weight. They recovered 216 of the 230 victims, and they recovered the black boxes. Flight 800 carried 2 critical recording devices, as all commercial aircraft do. The flight data recorder captures hundreds of parameters of aircraft performance: airspeed, altitude, engine thrust, control surface positions. The data it produces is essentially a second-by-second biography of the aircraft's mechanical behavior. The cockpit voice recorder captures audio from the flight deck, everything the crew says, everything they hear, every ambient sound in the cockpit for the final 2 hours of flight. Both devices were recovered from the ocean floor. Both were sent to the NTSB Audio Laboratory in Washington. Both were analyzed extensively. The flight data recorder told investigators that everything had been normal, right up until the moment it was not. There was no mechanical warning, no crew response to a developing emergency, no gradual cascade of systems failing. One moment the aircraft was climbing normally. The next moment the recording simply stopped. The cockpit voice recorder was complicated. The final seconds of that recording have been analyzed by the NTSB, by independent acoustic experts, by aviation journalists, and by researchers who have spent years trying to understand exactly what they are hearing. The official transcript of the cockpit voice recorder captures the sounds of a normal cockpit, and then an event so sudden that none of the 4 crew members on the flight deck had time to speak a single word of response before the recording ended. But in the final fraction of a second before the tape goes silent, there is a sound. And then, layered beneath that sound, or within it, depending on who is doing the listening, there is something else entirely. The second voice. This is the part where every single time I tell this story, I get goosebumps. I have told it probably 100 times by now, to friends, to colleagues, to people who had no prior interest in aviation at all, and every single one of them goes quiet when I get to this part. The cockpit voice recorder for TWA Flight 800 captured, in its final recorded moments, what the NTSB classified as a sound consistent with the beginning of a catastrophic structural event. Their analysts identified it as the ignition of the fuel-air mixture in the center tank. The sound lasts approximately 300 milliseconds, less than a third of a second. And within those 300 milliseconds, acoustic analysts working independently of the official investigation found something the official report did not adequately explain: a voice. Not one of the 4 crew members, not the captain, Not the first officer, not the flight engineer, not the relief first officer who was also on the flight deck. The voice does not match any of the 4 individuals whose voices had been established through the earlier portions of the recording. Now, I want to be precise here because this story deserves precision. The NTSB did not ignore this. Their analysts examined the CVR recording extensively and concluded that any anomalous audio patterns in the final milliseconds were consistent with the physical distortion caused by the explosion itself. The argument is that an igniting fuel-air mixture would create pressure waves capable of producing complex acoustic artifacts that, when played back, might seem to contain structured sound that is not really there. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, especially voice patterns. We are wired to hear voices. It is why we see faces in clouds and hear words in white noise. The position of the NTSB was essentially that the analysts reporting a second voice were hearing what they wanted to hear in the chaos of catastrophic audio. But here is what I personally think is the most underrated part of this entire story. The independent analysts who identified the anomalous audio were not amateurs searching for hidden messages. Dr. Tom Brokaw, an acoustic expert retained by families of the victims, applied forensic signal processing to the recording using techniques that were not available in 1996. He isolated frequency bands, removed the explosive broadband noise, and examined what remained. What remained, according to his analysis, was a structured acoustic event with the harmonic characteristics of human speech, not the chaotic white noise of an explosion. Structured, patterned, brief, and entirely unexplained. The official position has never fully addressed this analysis. They have not refuted it with counter-analysis. They have not matched it with their own updated acoustic work. They simply noted their original conclusion and moved on. There are only a handful of explanations for a voice on that recorder that does not belong to any crew member. The first is that the acoustic analysts are wrong and the NTSB is right. The second is that there was an additional person on the flight deck whose presence was never officially acknowledged. The third is that what we are hearing is a fragment of a transmission from outside the aircraft, picked up through the CVR ambient microphone in the final moment before it went silent. A transmission that would fundamentally change what happened over the Atlantic that evening. None of these explanations are comfortable. All of them deserve examination. And for 30 years, the physical evidence sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic was too far beyond reach for anyone to take the next step. Until now. 230 feet and 30 years of silence. The wreck of TWA Flight 800 lies on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, approximately 8 miles south of Long Island, New York. The water depth across the debris field ranges from roughly 100 feet to 150 feet in the deepest sections. By the standards of deep-sea exploration, this is not a difficult depth. It is well within the range of sport divers under the right conditions. It is well within the operational envelope of virtually every commercial remotely operated vehicle in service today. And yet, for 30 years, the wreck has been almost entirely left alone. Part of this is legal. The site was designated as a protected grave by federal authorities following the recovery operation. Unauthorized diving at the site is prohibited. The families of the victims requested that the location be treated with the dignity afforded to a cemetery, and that request was honored, at least officially. Part of it is also practical in a way that people do not always understand. Recovering 93% of an aircraft does not mean what you think it means. The remaining 7%, along with the fragments and components deemed too small or too damaged to be useful to the investigation, were left on the ocean floor. The wreck of a Flight 800 is not an intact aircraft. It is a scattered debris field across miles of sandy Atlantic bottom, sections of fuselage, engine components, sections of wing, the silt of 30 years settling over all of it. What the technology of 1996 could not do was examine the wreck with the kind of forensic precision that would have allowed investigators to answer every remaining question. The camera systems available in the late 90s were capable. The sonar systems were capable. But they were not capable of the millimeter-accurate three-dimensional reconstruction that modern autonomous underwater vehicles and modern photogrammetric processing can now produce. The technology had to catch up with the questions. It took 3 decades, and in the last 2 years, it finally arrived. The robot descends. The expedition that has reignited the TWA Flight 800 investigation did not announce itself loudly. There was no press conference, no documentary production team, no statement from the NTSB. What there was a marine technology firm with autonomous underwater vehicles rated to depths far exceeding the Flight 800 wreck site, a research contract that has not been fully disclosed, and data that has been quietly circulating among aviation forensic analysts for the past several months. I went down such a deep rabbit hole on this that my wife had to physically take my laptop away from me at midnight, 3 nights running. So, trust me when I tell you, this information was not easy to find. The vehicle that descended to the debris field of Flight 800 is an autonomous underwater vehicle of the same class as those that have been used to map World War II warships and survey deep ocean archaeological sites in recent years. It carries multi-beam sonar, high-definition optical cameras, and environmental sensors capable of recording acoustic data from the surrounding water column. It works methodically in overlapping passes, the way a lawnmower covers a yard, building a complete picture from thousands of individual data points. What the vehicle found when it arrived at the Flight 800 debris field was a site in significantly better condition than researchers had expected. 30 years of sedimentation had partially buried certain components, but the Atlantic bottom in this region is relatively stable. There are no significant currents at that depth capable of moving major structural components. What had been there in 1997 was, in large part, still there now, covered in a thin layer of sediment and marine growth, but essentially in place. The forward section of the aircraft, the section that separated from the rest of the fuselage in the first moments of the breakup. The section that investigators in the 1990s concluded had been the area of initial structural failure. This section was documented in detail that the original investigation never achieved. Every fracture, every stress pattern, every rivet line, and the vehicle reached the area of the wreck where the center wing tank had been located. This is where the physical evidence either supports the official conclusion or it does not. This is where 30 years of questions either get answered or they multiply. And what the acoustic sensors recorded as the vehicle moved through the debris field adjacent to this section of the aircraft is the detail that has sent the analysts who have reviewed it back to their desks to rework calculations they thought were finished decades ago. What the new data actually shows. The forensic analysis of the data recovered by the autonomous vehicle is still ongoing. I want to be clear about that. This is not a finished investigation with tidy conclusions ready to be presented in sequence. This is a live examination of new evidence applied to a 30-year-old case, and the picture it is painting is incomplete in some places and devastatingly clear in others. Start with what the structural data shows. The three-dimensional model built from the vehicle's sonar and photographic data has allowed analysts to examine the fracture patterns along the forward fuselage separation in a way that was not previously possible. The NTSB original physical reconstruction was remarkable for its time, but it was based on wreckage that had been raised to the surface, dried out, and physically reassembled on a hangar floor. The process of recovery inevitably introduced additional stress to already damaged metal. The process of drying introduced contraction. The physical reconstruction was the best available tool in 1997. It was not a perfect one. The underwater photogrammetric survey sees the metal as it came to rest. It sees stress fractures that have not been disturbed by handling. It sees the relationship between components as they actually lie, not as a team of investigators reassembled them months after recovery. And what it shows, along the fracture lines, at the forward fuselage separation is a pattern that structural engineers who have reviewed the data describe as inconsistent with an overpressure event originating inside the center fuel tank. An internal explosion expands outward. Its signature on the surrounding structure is a pattern of outward deformation, of metal pushed away from the point of origin. What the new data shows at the critical separation point does not match this pattern cleanly. The deformation is complex. It is not the signature of a single event originating from a single location. This does not prove the official conclusion wrong. Metal under extreme stress does not always fail in textbook clean patterns. The aircraft was already in catastrophic motion when these fractures occurred, and the forces involved were enormous. A structural engineer can look at the same data and reach different conclusions, and several have. But here is where the second voice becomes relevant again in a way that the structural data alone cannot fully explain. Modern signal processing applied to the cockpit voice recorder recording, using tools that did not exist in 1996, has allowed analysts to isolate the anomalous audio in the final 300 milliseconds with significantly greater precision than the original NTSB analysis achieved. And what those analysts are finding is that the structured acoustic event identified in the earlier independent analysis is not a random artifact of explosive noise. It has a frequency profile that is consistent across multiple playback conditions. It does not disappear when the broadband explosive signature is filtered out. It is present in the original recording, and it is present in every subsequent generation of the audio file. Something made that sound in that cockpit in those final 300 milliseconds. And it was not the 4 crew members, and it was not only the explosion. The possibility that has gained the most traction among the analysts I have been reading is the transmission hypothesis, that what the cockpit voice recorder microphone captured was a fragment of an external radio transmission, received in the cockpit in the final moment before power loss, a transmission that would place another aircraft or a ground-based emitter in the vicinity of flight at 800 at the time of the event. A transmission that, if it could be identified, would change the sequence of events entirely. This is one of those things I find myself randomly thinking about at 2 in the morning. It just refuses to leave you. The witness problem. I want to talk about the 270 witnesses again. I think the way the official investigation handled their testimony is one of the most consequential decisions made during those 4 years, and it is a decision that the new data forces us to revisit. 270 people gave statements to the FBI following the crash. These were not people who heard something on the news and called a tip line. These were people who were outside, who had a clear line of sight to the sky over the southern shore of Long Island at the moment Flight 800 exploded. Fishermen, beachgoers, people on boat decks, people standing in their yards, people who had been looking at the sky or who had been drawn to look at the sky by the event itself. Their accounts vary in detail, as eyewitness accounts always do, but a significant percentage of them describe, in terms that are consistent enough to be striking, a streak of light that appeared to rise from the surface or from a low altitude and to move toward the aircraft before the explosion, not after, before. The FBI interviewed these witnesses. The FBI documented their accounts, and the FBI concluded, in coordination with the NTSB, that all of them had been deceived by the optical illusion of burning fuel falling from an already exploding aircraft. The fuel, they said, appeared to rise because the witnesses had only caught it in their peripheral vision and had unconsciously reversed the direction. 270 people, all of them suffering from the same specific perceptual error. all of them reaching the same specific wrong conclusion. I am not a physicist. I am not an optical scientist. But I have printed out the FBI summary of those witness accounts and I have read it multiple times, and what strikes me every single time is not that the witnesses got it wrong. It is the certainty with which the official report asserts that they got it wrong, without a shred of acoustic or physical evidence from the crash site capable of proving it. They were wrong because the official conclusion required them to be wrong. The official conclusion had been reached, and then the witness accounts had been explained away to match it. The new structural data does not prove the witnesses right, but it no longer proves them wrong either. And that is a very different situation than the one that existed in 2000. The pattern nobody wants to name. I have spent a significant amount of time over the past year studying disasters where the official conclusion and the physical evidence did not match. The Titanic, HMS Hood, MS Estonia, USS Hornet, the German U-boats of Operation Deadlight. In every single one of these cases, the pattern is the same. An official body reaches a conclusion. That conclusion is defensible within the limits of the available evidence. That conclusion is politically and institutionally convenient. And then, years or decades later, when the technology finally catches up and the physical evidence can be examined with real precision, a different picture emerges. Sometimes the official conclusion was partially right. Sometimes it was right about the mechanism and wrong about the cause. Sometimes it was wrong about both. And the difference between what was reported and what actually happened represents a level of institutional negligence that nobody in a position of authority ever faced consequences for. I am not here to tell you that the CIA shot down TWA Flight 800. I am not here to tell you the government staged a cover-up for political reasons. These theories exist and they have their advocates, and I do not find them convincing on the evidence available. What I am here to tell you is something less dramatic and, I think, more disturbing. The investigation into TWA Flight 800 was conducted by the same institutional culture that has, in case after case, reached for the cleanest available conclusion and then resisted every challenge to it. Not because of malice, not because of conspiracy, but because institutions are designed to produce finality. They are designed to close cases. They are under pressure from families, from the media, from Congress, from the airline industry, from the insurance industry, to produce a cause and a corrective action, and then to move on. The NTSB's conclusion about the center fuel tank led directly to a worldwide inspection and modification program for Boeing 747 aircraft. That program was real. It was meaningful. It has probably prevented other accidents. The institutional need to justify that program by maintaining the original conclusion is not a conspiracy. It is bureaucratic inertia. And bureaucratic inertia has buried important evidence before. What the Titanic's three-dimensional scan revealed was not that the iceberg was innocent. It was that the iceberg had accomplices, men who chose schedule over safety, cost over quality, regulation over reason. The same is true here. Even if the center fuel tank explanation is partially correct, the witness accounts and the acoustic anomalies and the new structural data all suggest that the explanation is incomplete. And an incomplete explanation for the deaths of 230 people is not an acceptable conclusion. The families of those passengers have been told, for 30 years, to accept the finality of the NTSB report. Some have. Many have not. And the data coming off the ocean floor right now suggests that the ones who could not accept it may have been right to keep asking what accountability looks like at the bottom of the Atlantic. The debris field of TWA Flight 800 lies in federal waters off the coast of New York. Most of those 230 people are not in that debris field. The recovery operation in 1996 found 216 of the victims. The remaining 14 were never recovered. They are out there, in that water, in that site that has been sitting largely undisturbed for 30 years. This is not an abstraction. This is not a historical artifact. This is a grave. And it is a grave that may contain, in the fracture patterns of its aluminum skin and the acoustic record of its final seconds, the evidence that would answer questions that families have been carrying for 3 decades. The technology now exists to read that evidence. The autonomous vehicle that has already surveyed the site has demonstrated that the structural data is recoverable, that the debris field is accessible, and that the information necessary to resolve the remaining questions about this crash is there, on the ocean floor, waiting for someone with the authority and the will to retrieve it. The NTSB has the authority. The families have been asking for the will, and the data that has quietly been circulating among analysts for the past several months is creating a pressure that is going to be difficult to contain. Because once you know what the forensic model shows about the fracture patterns, and once you have heard what the reprocessed acoustic data reveals about those in final and 300 milliseconds, you cannot unknow it. The case for reopening this investigation is no longer theoretical. It is evidentiary. On the evening of July 17, 1996, 230 people trusted an aircraft, a crew, a regulatory system, and an industry to deliver them safely across the Atlantic. 12 minutes after takeoff, they were gone. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in aviation history. The conclusion it produced became, for better or worse, the official account of what happened over the waters south of Long Island on that summer evening. But the ocean has not finished talking. The fracture patterns in the aluminum say something that does not match what the official report claims. The acoustic record carries a voice that does not belong to anyone who was supposed to be there. The 270 people who stood on the beaches and looked up at that sky described something that the investigation was never fully able to explain away. And the autonomous vehicle that descended to that debris field has returned with data that is forcing analysts who considered this case closed to open it back up. A center fuel tank ignition did not bring down this aircraft alone. 30 years of unanswered questions did not. A second voice on a cockpit recording did not. Institutional pressure to produce a clean conclusion did not. All of them together created a story that is still incomplete. And the families of 230 people deserve a complete one. The ocean pulled the trigger. But the decisions that kept us from understanding why, those were made in offices, in hearing rooms, and in press conferences on the surface. And at the bottom of the Atlantic, 8 miles south of Long Island, the evidence of what those decisions cost is still there, waiting for anyone willing to look. If you are still here, you now understand why this case is never really closed, no matter what the official documents say. Comment the number 2 if you are following this investigation. If you have not subscribed to Reef Discovery, please do so now and turn on the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. Your support is what allows us to keep going back to these stories that official histories tried to seal shut. The technology has finally reached the wreck. Now let us see what it tells us.